we've definitely seen the tempo of Russian offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast slow. They start to slow pretty immediately. Uh, by May 14th, we had started to see the tempo slow, the advances slow, but that's not to necessarily state that it is over. Russian forces could be pausing to prepare for launching intensified waves of assaults, and they are likely preparing for a second phase of their offensive operation in northern Kharkiv Oblast.
And so, why do we think it is starting to slow down? Is that because of tactics we're seeing, maybe new tactics from the Ukrainians?
No, not necessarily. Russian forces conducted limited offensive operations. That didn't seem like the case because there was relatively rapid gains when they launched offensive operations into northern Kharkiv Oblast on May 10th, but they advanced through relatively less defended areas, small border settlements that Russian forces had largely destroyed by the time they went to go advance into those settlements. And Ukrainian officials have confirmed that those areas were less defended. So those are some of the reasons why we saw rapid gains. But Russian forces have committed very limited manpower to these operations. There was a lot of reporting that Russian forces intended to create a grouping of forces in the international border area between 50,000 to 70,000 personnel in size. A lot of the reporting that we have seen from Ukrainian sources is that they only got that grouping up to around 35,000 personnel when they launched the offensive operation to northern Kharkiv Oblast. And we haven't really seen Russian forces introduce additional reserves to sustain the tempo of offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast, indicating that they're likely still building out this force grouping, and they might have launched this offensive operation earlier than they intended.
And to what extent do you think some of the early gains that Russia made in the northeast when it launched this offensive are down to the fact that the Ukrainians made a deliberate strategy to withdraw some of their forces and trade space for time?
I don't know if that is the case, but I definitely think there is not a utility in defending right at the border that opens you up to more Russian artillery. Russian artillery can operate more securely within Belgorod Oblast. Defending a little further back from the border allows Ukrainian forces a little bit more security. It also puts Russian forces in a bit more of a bind, attacking into the main line of defense further in to northern Kharkiv Oblast than right at the border.
What do you think the wider strategic objective is for Russia in the northeast? There's been talk of them trying to create a buffer zone. Do you think that is what they're trying to achieve?
I think the strategic element of this, the strategic objective, is to draw and fix Ukrainian forces across a wider front in northeastern Ukraine. Russian forces have been conducting ongoing offensive operations in eastern Ukraine since October 2023. Opening this front in northern Kharkiv Oblast has forced Ukrainian forces to transfer materiel, manpower from other sectors of the front, and it fixes them to this international border area so they can't deploy elsewhere to ongoing Russian offensive operations elsewhere in eastern Ukraine. So we have seen that this has achieved its impacts. There is reporting that Ukrainian forces have redeployed elements from many sectors of the front to Kharkiv Oblast, northern Kharkiv Oblast, and we have seen Russian forces try to exploit that and intensify offensive operations in areas where Ukrainian forces have redeployed units. That's the strategic objective of this. And it's not just the ongoing offensive operations that we see in northern Kharkiv Oblast, it's even the concentrations elsewhere in Belgorod Oblast, in Kursk, Bryansk, along the border with Sumy Oblast and other areas of northern Kharkiv Oblast. Even though there's not ongoing offensive operations there, those concentrations do have an intended effect of fixing elements further along the international border area and kind of putting Ukraine on its toes about preparing defensive positions, preparing for defensive operations, just in case there is further offensive activity further along the border area. There's also operational intent. to the offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast. One is this buffer zone that you mentioned. This has been a routine line in the Kremlin and the Russian information space about the need to create a buffer zone, a sanitary zone into Kharkiv Oblast to protect border areas in Russia from Ukrainian shelling, specifically Belgorod city. And this has been a long time justification that Russian sources, Russian officials have used to argue for further gains in other areas of the front. If you start to think about it, the border zone, the buffer zone kind of doesn't have an end, because once they establish and occupy that area, then that area is under shelling, and it becomes this ever creeping front and justification for further and further gains into Ukraine. And we have seen Russian officials kind of acknowledge that that is the case. We've had Dmitry Medvedev state that the buffer zone really needs to extend all the way to the borders of Ukraine and possibly into Poland. So this is very much a justification for establishing a foothold in northern Kharkiv Oblast. There's also another possible operational intent of advancing not to the boundaries of Kharkiv city, but to within tube artillery range of Kharkiv city, or effective tube artillery range, so that Russian forces could deploy artillery elements and conduct routine indirect fire on Kharkiv city and prepare for a larger offensive operation on the city at a later date.
I kind of share your skepticism about the buffer zone argument, because if you look at the amount of territory that Russia have gained in recent weeks in the northeast, yes, okay, it's symbolically important and it's disappointing for the Ukrainians, but it's not actually that much territory when you look at it on a map, and it hasn't appeared to prevent the Ukrainians still having success at targeting Belgorod.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at the area, maybe it's creating a buffer zone immediately south of Belgorod city, but there's still areas in northwestern Kharkiv Oblast and Sumy Oblast that Ukrainian forces could use to strike into Belgorod Oblast. So they're creating this very narrow buffer zone. And so that's something we might see in a possible second phase of the offensive operation here, as an attempt to widen that buffer zone along a wider section of the border area.
Well, that's interesting. That brings us on to what Russia may do next. You mentioned Sumy Oblast. Do you think that is where we're going to have to look next, and that is where Russia are going to prioritize next?
So we recently saw, I think this was yesterday, President Zelensky state that there is a unspecified grouping of forces of an unspecified size being concentrated in western Belgorod Oblast. He didn't quite state where. He said 90 kilometers northwest of Kharkiv city, but that's notably in an area that allows Russian forces to either launch offensive operations to the west into Sumy Oblast, or to the south into northwestern Kharkiv Oblast. And that kind of allows them to have this greater effect of drawing and fixing Ukrainian forces, because Ukrainian forces don't really know the operational intent of that grouping of forces, and so they will have to prepare for possible defensive operations both in Sumy Oblast near the border, but also in northwestern Kharkiv Oblast near the border. So it has this wider strategic objective, whether or not Russian forces attack into Sumy or whether they attack into northwestern Kharkiv Oblast.
Just on that, Riley, how is that seen in Russia when you hear Western countries, for example, the UK, pledging to commit to 2.5% of GDP defence spending, when you have, two newer members of NATO than we had 2 years ago? Did Russia miscalculate, and how is it viewed now in terms of the response that we've seen from the West? Albeit, as we've been articulating, there'll be people who think the West needs to go further.
I definitely think this is a strategic failure on Russia's part. A lot of what Russia was demanding before the full-scale invasion was this strategic demand on NATO to weaken itself, to split the alliance, to roll it back to the borders before it started expanding in Eastern Europe. And so the fact that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, that is a strategic failure. If the war in Ukraine aimed to weaken NATO, to ensure that Russia could possibly win in a conventional war against NATO, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, that is a strategic failure. I think the West's response has had a mixed result, though. I think specifically the past few months, with these increased debates about support for Ukraine, the delays in Western security assistance, specifically in the United States, did convince a whole lot of Russian officials in the Kremlin that there is a finite limit to Western support and that Russian forces can outweigh and outlast whatever materiel the West provides to Ukraine in the near to medium term, and then achieve victory once the West decides that these debates are going to resume and that delays are going to continue. Although I do think Russian officials do use the West's response to their advantage to tell their public, to justify the war in Ukraine as a wider scale war with the collective West, as a war with NATO.
And just finally, Riley, as an analyst, where will you be looking at most closely, or what will you be looking out for in the next few months to give us a sense of the direction in which this war is heading?
So, Russian forces are still expected to launch a large-scale summer offensive effort. That is not what Russian forces launched in northern Kharkiv Oblast. That could be the initial preparatory phase for that large-scale summer offensive effort, but Russian forces still haven't started that. They've been preparing operational reserves for that effort, and Ukrainian officials have been routinely warning that there is going to be this large-scale offensive effort. And likely that will be somewhere in eastern Ukraine where Russian forces have been conducting ongoing offensive operations. So that's either going to be along the Kupiansk-Svyatova-Kreminna line, the Kharkiv-Luhansk axis, near Chasiv Yar, or west of Avdiivka. It's a little unclear where Russian forces intend to launch that large-scale offensive effort, but they'll likely do it in an area where they see opportunities to make rapid tactical gains and possibly operationally significant gains. We will see resumed U.S. security assistance arrive to the front line at scale sometime in June and July, according to Western and Ukrainian officials, and that will give Ukrainian forces the capability to blunt a whole lot of Russian advances.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.